Friday 13th parts 2, 3, and 4, while technically not a trilogy, I do always watch them together because they take place on consecutive nights. And so from the time that we meet Jeff and Sandra at the beginning of part 2 to the point where Trish and Tommy are in the hospital at the end of part 4, 7 nights have passed. Night 1, Crazy Ralph is killed. Night 2 is the massacre of the Packanack counselors. Night 3, which is the beginning of part 3, is when Jason kills the Crystal Lake shop owners. Night 4 is the massacre at Higgins Haven. Night 5, Jason kills Axel and Nurse Morgan at the Wessex County Hospital. Night 6 is a peaceful night. It's the night that Tommy is peeping on Samantha and Paul. And night 7 is when Jason kills Mrs. Jarvis, Rob, and the kids next door. So back when I was a kid, I never really paid much attention to the bar sequences in part 2 because I was too busy being in love with Terry. Like, she was my everything back when I watched Friday 13th Part 2 for the first time. However, there is one character that I just ignore, and I think most people kind of forget about, who, along with about 6 other counselors, went out to go drink on the night of the massacre in Part 2. And while we know they survived, we never really hear from them again. So the character Ted in Part 2 is very important to the theories I'm about to drop on y'all. So Ted, as we know, he's like the class clown. He's the life of the party of part 2. And he manages to survive the movie just by along with those 6 other counselors, just by simply staying out all night. They go to an after hour spot, if I'm not mistaken, it is said in the bar. And so Ted, now, this character is way more important than we realize because if you remember correctly, Jeff and Sandra, he's there to meet them when they first arrive, and they pick him up. He has to load his gear on, and they drive to the camp. Now, when Jeff and Sandra are not allowed to go to the go to the bar because they went to Crystal Lake and got caught, Ted has the keys to Jeff's truck. That's important. So they all go out to the bar. Everybody's killed. Everybody who's left behind is killed. And as far as we know, like, as far as you remember, if you just watch part 2 and then go into 3 later, it'll talk about Jenny being the only survivor. However, it doesn't account for Ted and the 6 remaining counselors. In part 3, before Jason kills the shop owners, it's mentioned on the news that the names of the victims haven't been released yet until their families have been notified. Now, back to Ted, okay? Ted's an interesting character because when talking to Jenny at the bar, it's made clear that he doesn't believe that Jason is real. Like, he says something like, 2 of our kids got busted because some girl flipped in a boat, suggesting that he doesn't believe that Jason pulled Alice into the lake at the end of the first movie. But Ted would, of course, survive and eventually sober up and go back to Packanack to discover that there was a massacre. And while the killer is still on the loose at that point, Jason's still on the loose at that point, Ted has the keys to Jeff's truck. And if you remember how Jeff and Sandra were killed, they were killed with the weapon that Ted brought into the house. Nothing about Ted says that he wouldn't feel guilty for that. He would, feel emotion, especially since so many of his friends, kids that he took responsibility for, because he was, the second in command at the Camp Packanack training. So more than likely, at some point, which is most likely the first night of part 3, which is the night that, the shop owners were killed, he probably went back to the town that Jeff and Sandra were from. He probably drove Jeff's truck back to that town to notify Jeff and Sandra's parents himself. At which point he would meet Rob, who doesn't appear until part 4. Rob is Sandra's brother, as we come to find out. Now, most likely, Rob and Jeff's families probably sent Rob together. That's probably where he got all his gear. Because remember, he had a sea bag, he had a hiking pack, he had a rifle, and he had a machete of his own. Because at this point, they don't know that Jason's going to be killed the very next night at Higgins Haven, at least temporarily. So by the time, I imagine that Ted drove Rob to Crystal Lake, to the hospital, to speak with Jenny, the survivor, because she gives a description. And that's probably when while there, Higgins Havens is taking place. Jason's hit with the axe by Chris. She's probably brought to that hospital. And then Jason's probably downstairs in the morgue. But if you remember correctly, Jason doesn't stay at that morgue that long. He's almost instantly out of there. And so Rob probably didn't tell Ted that he was leaving. So Ted's still at that hospital. Rob goes, takes his gear out of the truck, and on foot begins to track Jason. If you remember correctly, he actually does track Jason really well, because at the point where he meets Trish and Tommy, Jason's like a few yards away in the woods, because the costumes don't add up for Jason and Rob, because we're led to believe that it was Rob that was standing in those woods, but it wasn't. It was Jason. And so when the whole time that, Rob is out in the woods, he hangs out with the Jarvises, probably has dinner with the Jarvises, then he goes in the woods, and then the massacre takes place. So during the night before, it's very feasible that, Ted in his guilt was like, yo, I can help you figure out who this was. And they probably went back to that bar and they talked to everybody. And that's probably where all the newspaper clippings came in, because those newspapers come out quickly in that area, because Mrs. Jarvis, when she reads the paper, it already says that the body is missing. And when Rob talks to Trish when she comes to his tent, he knows that the body is missing, that not only is Jason gone from the morgue, but he knows that there were two, that Axel and Nurse Morgan are missing, and they were killed by Jason at the beginning of part 4. So part 4 takes place, and so what I wonder the most, because once again, this is about Ted. Ted is probably still at that hospital, he's probably talking to Jenny. He's probably talked to Chris, and he probably feels a lot of guilt, But then Tommy and Trish show up, and Trish would know what happened to Rob. And so at one point, Ted probably walked in on Trish and asked about Rob. And Trish tells him that Rob probably died. Well, that Rob is dead. He did die. She probably told him that he died. And so I think that Trish and Ted bonded over that. And they probably got married in the future. That's why you don't hear about them no more. You only hear about Tommy. And I think that the reason why Tommy becomes so articulate by part 6, because in part 5, Tommy doesn't want to talk to anybody. But in part 6, he's very social and he's got game. I think it's because he has Ted as his brother-in-law to help him get through things. And maybe in part 5, he went out on his own. He was, kind of dealing with his own thing. But by the time part 6 roll around, Trish and Ted probably are an established couple, and they probably visited Tommy, a few more times and helped him, get better. Because if you remember correctly, Ted had a liking for masks, and so did Tommy. And there's another character that in part 3, I kind of overlooked part 3 because the writing is just horrible. But For all we know, Ted was still in that hospital because he probably knew Shelley. It's very possible that Ted and Shelley met each other at like a theater camp or just by doing theater programs in the area. Because when I was growing up, like there were summer programs where you would, be with theater kids from all over the area. So I believe that Ted is a way more important character than we realize off screen because I think he's the one that drove Rob up to Crystal Lake. And then they were at the hospital. They went to the bar and did all the research, got the newspaper clippings from the old newspaper clippings from locals. And then they were just keeping up to date with what was happening because Rob was intending to track Jason. And he started tracking him from the morgue, like from when Jason escaped from the morgue. And that's why when they met Tommy and Trish, Rob called up to Jason and they were yards away. Had Rob not got distracted by Tommy and Trish, he might have actually successfully defeated Jason because he still had his gun at the time. But let me know what y'all think. Do y'all think Ted and Trish ended up getting married by the end of it all? I mean, that's what I was getting at by all this. I think Ted and Trish got together.